Banks and insurance companies across the nation are critical to helping us decarbonize our economy. In fact, it's hard to think of an industry that has more impact because banks loan to every sector and insurance companies insure every sector. So we've just releasing a new report on banks that highlight the risk of the largest 24 banks and their finance admissions. What the report highlights is that it's very important for banks to publicly disclose to investors and regulators and others what their loan portfolios are like, and then have a very deliberate plan to decarbonize their portfolio over the next several years with interim goals. That as one example of the risks, just in the last 2 months alone, 3 oil companies have written off over $30 billion of assets. That's $30 billion that isn't going to be repaid to investors, to shareholders, to lenders and insurance companies. That's an important number, but the number of potential risk is many times that. So it's very important for the financial stability as well as the climate future. Climate is critical, and banks need to play a very active role in looking at their financed admissions to not just the oil industry, but in industries that use fossil fuels as part of their manufacturing, agriculture, and others. There's nothing more urgent than what we can do.
Point of a financial stress test is not that different from health-based stress tests that people go through. A stress test, whether financial or health related, is designed to tell you how a body or a system will perform when faced with an external and a bad stressor. And the information that we learn from these tests will allow us to take the needed corrective action, whether it's a diet, whether it's exercise, or whether it's improving risk management systems within a financial institution. Now, the reason why you are seeing US and global regulators call for stress testing, either national and global financial markets or national or global financial institutions, for their resilience to climate change shocks, it's more important now than it ever has been. Our markets, our financial institutions are particularly vulnerable now because of everything that they've suffered as a part of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. And it is therefore more important than ever to identify weaknesses and take corrective action now before the catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis are in fact upon us. So we need to be proactive rather than reactive on climate change, and stress tests will get us the information to allow us to take the necessary action in a smart and considered way. And it's widely considered that this is a step that US financial regulators will in fact take in a Biden administration.
Banks, we think, need to do more stress testing for different climate eventualities. And there is both an upside in terms of new green jobs and opportunities there, but there's also, what if there's a price on carbon? What if there's different changes? So it's important that banks do this and share those numbers. We're not saying some banks aren't doing this now, but to share those with investors and regulators and customers. It's important for their stability. It's also helping to build in the cost of carbon and of these areas. Stress test is not a new concept. Banks do it all the time in other areas, but it's not as detailed in climate. And there is some work being done around the world. And what happens is there's an expression that is what is measured gets managed, and therefore what people look at, then they plan for those more scenarios. Today, our world is more prepared for a pandemic than we were a year ago, and that's which is a good thing to be prepared. Hopefully it'll never happen again. And so it's very important that all the regulatory agencies require stress tests and scenario analysis, and the banks do those and share those so that their own investors, their customers, their directors and regulators can be prepared for the climate future. We're seeing wildfires like we've never seen before, hurricanes, natural changes all over, tornadoes and droughts. And those as awful as what we're facing now is, we know that climate's there'll be no vaccine for it, so there's no quote quick fix. It's just going to get worse unless we make these changes. That's why these kind of planning tools, stress tests, are so important.
My take, and there are a number of takes on this, is that the biggest impediment to the lack of movement at scale by the financial community on climate change is the lack of data. Because the research is out there. You have seen, really tomes of research come through from large mainstream financial institutions, your Goldman Sachs, your Deutsche Banks, your Morgan Stanleys, reiterating the point that we at Ceres have been making for years, which is that climate change is a financial risk, climate change is a material risk, and increasingly climate change is being seen as a risk that undermines the very stability of financial markets. In other words, climate change is a systemic risk. But one of the main reasons that I believe that we haven't seen investors act at scale is because they just don't have the information to accurately price in the risks that climate change poses to their portfolios and take smart action with smart information. We have seen a tremendous growth in the volume of climate change information coming out from the corporate sector, building on the great frameworks that are out there, including CDP, the TCFD, GRI, and SASB. But because this disclosure is still voluntary, the disclosure is not at scale, it's still coming mainly from large institutions and not mid-sized institutions, it's not quite comparable, and it's largely not seen as reliable. Mandates for climate change disclosure will address these issues, which is why we at Ceres have been calling for the SEC to issue rules on climate change disclosure for years.
So the number one thing that we want to ask every financial regulator to do, the federal financial regulators and the state, is to declare that climate is a systemic risk to their banks or insurance companies, to their regulatory purview. Because once you declare it's a systemic risk, then it affects everything you do. It'll affect how you train your bank examiners, what kind of analysis, what kind of reserve margins, what kind of scenario analysis. So there's dozens of other things, but at first you have to understand the problem. And just as they've all said, the pandemic is a real and systemic risk to their banks and the people they regulate. We're asking every regulator to do that. That's being done by dozens across the globe, and there are several state regulators, particularly insurance regulators, that have done that now. But we need more leadership from the federal agencies and state agencies, and we need it today.